Hello, I'm Craig Timberg. I'm the national technology reporter at the Washington Post, and here is Christopher Wylie. He was the research director for Cambridge Analytica. I think you all are familiar with the story he helped bring to light a few months ago about the ways in which Facebook data was obtained and a lot of other data was obtained and used to help influence the outcome of elections and a lot of other things as well. And so before we get started, I want to remind everyone that you can tweet questions using the hashtag #FreeToState with no spaces. Anyway, let's start with a kind of a general question since we're here to talk about the First Amendment. Chris, what you talked about involved privacy, it involved political manipulation, it involved our democracy, arguably.
Yeah.
What's the connection here with the First Amendment from your point of view?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I'd say is that privacy is the foundation of freedom, right? Because privacy is what allows us to decide how we are and how we want to develop our personality in different contexts. Who do we want to be in our family? Who do we want to be with our friends? Who do we want to be at work, in public? Privacy is the tool that allows you to decide who you are in different contexts. And without privacy, we don't have freedom. We don't have, including freedom of speech. And when you look at sort of the notion of the First Amendment, and I say this as a non-American, as a Canadian, as an outsider, so I'll just caveat everything that I say. But when you look at what was envisioned when you have a country being set up as a democracy and having free speech as at the center of that, it's the public forum and it's debate. And when you look at what's happened with Cambridge Analytica or social media, and we take a step back and go, how was democracy envisioned back when the Bill of Rights was being drafted? You have a candidate, they stand up, they say what they think, and you have an audience, you have a community in a town square. Everybody hears the same thing. And that's really important because what I'm saying as a candidate is then open to scrutiny. People in the community can call me out if I lie, if I tell something that's untrue. It's open to debate. It's open to a candidate from another party or who's opposing me to call me out on something, and that's actually a really important facet of democracy, is this notion of the public forum and a common experience of what I am saying as a candidate or as somebody who's trying to convince you of something. When you look at what's happened in social media, it allows me as a candidate to erode the public forum because I now can go to each and every one of you in the audience and whisper in your ear something, right? And you don't know what I'm telling this person versus that person versus that person. And there's no way to scrutinize that. But I'm also doing it after having followed you around for weeks on end, seeing what you like, what you eat, where you go, who do you associate with, what do you talk about. And so as a candidate, all of a sudden, you are now able to speak individually to each person and whisper into their ear. And when we look at sort of how was the First Amendment imagined, or how was free speech sort of imagined back in the day, that was not physically possible to do. And the sort of intersection between data and technology and how speech is now sort of being engaged in our democracy, really the question that we have to answer is, if there is no ability for journalists or opposition candidates or even just civil society to scrutinize what is being said in our democracy, where the effect of that is that people start to engage with an election with a different understanding of what is real, are we eroding the foundation of our democracy itself?
It sounds like you're saying that sometimes there can be either maybe too much speech in a sense, or speech that's too narrowly delivered to really make it a functional part of a democracy.
Well, yeah, because the point about free speech is it's protecting your ability to say stuff in public.
Right.
Right. But the difference is that if you are a campaign or if you're a business or what have you that is saying things to each individual person, you have a message that's all being delivered in private.
Right.
And if that is not open to scrutiny, if people can't scrutinize because they don't know that it's happening, that's where you create these sort of cognitive monocultures that exist in the United States and elsewhere, because there's nothing that prevents it from happening in the first place because it's all hidden.
So, Chris, you and I met a few months ago back in London after the first few stories about the Cambridge Analytica stuff, and since then you've become very popular with law enforcement and regulators around the world. Can you tell us in general? I realize there's maybe some things you're not allowed to cover in this space, but talk to us in general about what are authorities interested in understanding about Cambridge Analytica and what happened there?
So it depends on the jurisdiction. So for example, in the UK, where there is the Data Protection Act, which is a specific piece of legislation to do with how data and personal information can be handled, that is the prism, that is the lens that regulators are looking at it. In the United States, there is no Data Protection Act. So when you look at what different regulators and the police are looking at, there's different aspects of the law here that may have been engaged, whether it's foreign corrupt practices, whether it is fraud, whether it is various pieces of consumer legislation or consumer protection legislation, or indeed, when you're looking at Facebook, the FTC and the consent decree that Facebook agreed to and whether they were compliant with that. So there's a lot of different agencies and a lot of different regulators in the United States that are looking at it from different perspectives. But the interesting thing that I've found, having dealt now with both American and European regulators, is that it's a lot simpler in Europe because there is data protection legislation.
There's bright laws that one could cross.
There's just very clear statutes.
Right.
Whereas here it's messy. It's like there's something feels wrong, but it's more complicated here because the laws are, there is no federal privacy law. There's no federal data protection law. And that's actually something that I've talked quite a bit about with various members of Congress and senators here, is that, it's interesting that you have the one Western developed country that it does not have national privacy legislation.
Right. And so as we walked in, on the video screen behind us, they showed Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart News, the former White House official, the former head of President Trump's campaign. I gather you knew Steve Bannon in his Cambridge Analytica incarnation. He was vice president. Yeah. You were a relatively senior official in that company. Tell me about Steve Bannon's role in Cambridge Analytica and what it did, and to what extent he knew about the things it was doing, including the collection of Facebook data.
Well, he knew about everything that was going on in the company because everything had to be authorized by him. It was him and Rebecca Mercer together who approved how money was spent, what projects could be, what projects were focused on, what they weren't, and also he was one of the people who, you have to remember, like when I joined SCL, this was before even Alexander Nix met Steve Bannon. This is Cambridge Analytica wasn't even a glimmer in our eyes yet. We weren't doing alt-right research. We weren't doing alt-right projects. That all came when Steve Bannon took over. So Cambridge Analytica became Cambridge Analytica because of Steve Bannon. He even picked the name. Like it very much was his vision of a company and what he wanted to do. Because when the problem for Steve was that, with Breitbart, it wasn't expanding into the mainstream in a way that he wanted. And when you think about a culture war, you need an arsenal of weapons to fight a culture war. And so the notion of using a foreign military contractor that specializes in information operations and psychological warfare for the military really appealed to him because he could then use that company to build informational weapons.
Let me just clarify this for a second. So there was an underlying company, SCL Group, based in London, that did psychological operations around government.
For the military, including for the Department of Defense here.
Including our own US government, British government. And out of that is born Cambridge Analytica when Rebecca Mercer and her father invest millions of dollars. Cambridge Analytica becomes essentially an American brand of the SCL project.
It acquired the intellectual property of SCL, put that into a new company in America called Cambridge Analytica, then licensed back the same IP to SCL, and then had an agreement where all contracts had to then go to SCL. So Cambridge Analytica didn't have any staff, right? Cambridge Analytica was a concept. It was a brand, it was an American thing, so that, because it would look optically bad. This is one of the things that I later learned, is that they were concerned that the optics of using a foreign military contractor in American elections would not play well.
What were they thinking? But it was an idea that was based, had an office in Manhattan, am I right? Right?
Yeah, I mean, they eventually set up an office.
Incorporated in Delaware.
Yeah.
And the vice president was?
Steve Bannon.
And the president was?
Rebecca Mercer.
And the most important financial backer was?
Bob Mercer.
So this
Robert Mercer.
Certainly like a substantial American footprint in the end, but all of the work was being done where?
In London. So the bulk of the, there was almost no Americans working in the company, because it wasn't, when the IP got acquired, we weren't working in the United States. The problem is, and they were warned, repeatedly that by lawyers, by Rudy Giuliani's law firm, sent a memo to Steve Bannon saying, hey, you can't have foreign agents operating in an election. You can't do that, and they completely disregarded that. And just kept going. I remember having conversations with them going, you need to create an American team to be compliant.
So if you were in London and they're in New York or Washington or wherever, how were you interacting with Steve Bannon and Rebecca Mercer?
Well, Steve would come to London all the time because he was also setting up Breitbart UK. So he had a lot of projects on the go in London. And so he would be there frequently, but conference calls and whatnot.
And what was he like?
It's funny because there's I remember two different Steve Bannons. So one, when it was before he took over, and I actually quite enjoyed talking to him, because one of the first conversations that I had with him was on the intersectional nature of identity, because he was quite interested in that. And one of the things he was really interested in culture, and because the Breitbart doctrine is that politics flows from culture, it's downstream from culture. So if you want to change politics, you have to change culture. And one of the things that I said is well, but you can't define what culture is. You haven't told me what culture is. And until you define it, you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you don't know what you're doing. You're just stabbing in the dark. And so one of the things that I said is, well, if you look at the words and language that we use to describe different cultures, and the words and language that we use to describe ourselves as people, often they're the same adjectives, right? So if you just indulge in some stereotyping for a second, what are Italians like? Maybe they're more passionate, maybe they're more neurotic, they're louder. What are Germans like? Sorry if I'm offending people. There might be more organized, more dutiful. And when you look at that from a data scientist perspective, actually what you're probably describing is just a curve. And you're describing that where the mean is on this curve is slightly higher or lower on certain traits or certain characteristics of people. And so the building blocks of culture maybe are people and their personalities, and that in the aggregate, that is what creates culture. That it is an aggregation of our commonly shared characteristics. And so if you wanted to measure culture and you wanted to change culture, you first would need to measure people. And once you create a measurement of people that corresponds to culture, when you want to move this curve one way or the other, you can literally create a list of people that you need to move that that one standard deviation out, and then that becomes your target universe. And so he found that really interesting. He also liked the idea that we were working on military projects, and he was the one that convinced Bob to buy into it.
And did Cambridge Analytica indulge in any voter suppression efforts, so far as you know?
Well, I am aware of various projects where voter suppression in the behavioral sense, so not vote caging or literally removing people off of lists, but identifying behavioral characteristics in certain target groups, mostly, as I understand it, African Americans, and finding things that will demotivate them to turn out.
What kinds of things?
So making politics sounding confusing or boring, or finding things that somebody really cares about and repositioning that to make them, essentially making people hate politics or find it confusing. But it depends on what sort of target group you're looking at, because different people will have different sort of motivators, or rather demotivators. But there was definitely memos and documentation that talked about quote unquote voter disengagement as a priority for certain projects. For
what clients?
Various PACs that were Mercer funded. And it's interesting because one of a company called UpGuard, which is a data security firm, found a misconfiguration in some of the Ripon software. And so
Ripon is a project at Cambridge Analytica for targeting American Republican candidates.
Yeah, so this was the software that took the data and then pushed out ads online. And one of the things that they actually found recently was there was a section of software code that actually was labeled like the disengagement module, the voter disengagement module.
Wow.
And so it was like suppression was built into some of the software that they were actually building for Republican clients.
So let's talk about Facebook for a second.
Sure.
Facebook, lots of people love Facebook, see pictures of their friends' babies and their trips, so they keep in touch with folks maybe they haven't seen for years. Did Facebook do something wrong here?
Oh, boy. So I think, I don't even know where to begin. So first of all, I think that Facebook hasn't been wholly candid with what it knew when, and what, how much did it tolerate the projects that were happening, because it actually approved the terms and conditions of the application. So before the data harvesting began, Facebook was notified with a new set of terms and conditions that said this data is going to be pulled, this is how it's going to be pulled, and it's going to be commercialized, transferred, and sold.
And this happens before it collects on 87 million people.
This happens before, and they approved it. Now, the CTO of Facebook at the British Parliament a couple weeks ago said that they may not have read the terms and conditions before they approved it.
It'd be like all of us, though.
And so
they always do that.
The irony of a company that says, oh, well, you've got these users that sign these terms and conditions, so they agree for us to do whatever we want with their data, don't even read terms and conditions of applications that then take that data also. And it's because, fundamentally, there's an aspect of Facebook's business model which is that doesn't involve privacy. You have to remember, when you're taking data off of Facebook, whether it is legitimately or illegitimately, that data often is just used to optimize Facebook advertising. So, and which is what happened with Cambridge Analytica. So, I suspect that Facebook turned the other way when it was happening, because ultimately they make money off of it. This is why when you think about even the very layout of Facebook, the likes page, right? When was the last time you ever went onto the likes page? When was it you ever looked at your own likes or somebody else's likes? Probably pretty rarely. When have you scrolled down all of the likes? Probably pretty rarely. So you've got all these features that make it really easy to scrape profiles that have no actual utility for users. And Facebook has designed their entire platform to just make data very easily available.
But don't we give them their data?
That's not to say that they're doing it intentionally, so that.
But we're giving it to them, right? How are they acting wrongly if we're just giving them all this data? Shouldn't they use it however they want?
No, because that's like saying, I should be able to build a building with no fire exits because it ruins the concept of my aesthetic. And so long as I put terms and conditions outside of the building that says you might burn alive. It's up to those people. If they burn alive, so be it. They wanted to see my conceptual building. You know, the thing that's really important, I think, for people to understand is that so in modern society, what job can you get where you refuse to use the internet? Right? It is the new electricity, right? So when people sign up to terms and conditions, it's a false choice, because it's like saying, well, if you don't want to get electrocuted, don't use electricity and go be a hermit in the mountains somewhere, right? It's not a real choice. And so it's not even what is Facebook doing wrong or what they're doing right. Or, you know, should people just leave Facebook? It's like, well, if you leave Facebook, you're still on Google. You know, you're still using Twitter. You're still using Uber. You're still using everything to do with modern society involves the collection and harvesting of data. And so we should not be thinking about it through the lens of this false consent in terms and conditions. We should be thinking about it like we do for everything else that's important in our lives, whether it's food, medicine, cars, whatever, in terms of safety, in terms of consumer rights, that you don't actually have a real choice to use what is effectively a utility on the internet. And so whether or not you agree or don't agree on these terms and conditions that no one reads, it should be a moot point. We should be creating, as a society, a common set of standards that apply universally to whatever technology company it is, that says this is what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do with data, full stop.
Well, this has been fascinating. I wish we had like another hour to dive into all of the many potential solutions to the problems you've outlined. This has been really interesting. Thank you, Christopher, for coming in.
Cheers.
Nice to see you again. Thank you all for listening. And I think there's more awesomeness coming, and so please stay tuned while the next group comes out.
Yeah, cheers.